Ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome. Let's start this virtual session here today. We are all gathered here to have this virtual discussion on the important topic of advancing engagement between India and Europe on business responsibility and sustainable development. This session is being organized by the EU-funded project run by Oxfam India. The project is called From Global Goals to Local Impact. I would like to invite our colleague from Oxfam India, Ms. Ranjana Das, to please come and moderate the event today. Over to you, Ranjana. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you so much. Dear friends, good morning, those who are joining us from Europe right now, and good afternoon for the friends in India. So as Anil said, welcome to this session of advancing engagement between India and Europe on business and sustainable development. Now, the next 1.5 hours, we are going to talk about business and human rights, sustainability, sustainable development goals, a lot of issues. I'll be, as Ruth was pointing, the tour guide today, connecting from the panelists, the conversations all together. It is, as Anil pointed out, in the context of our program From Global Goals to Local Impact. This will be largely a session of sharing with you all the learnings of the 3-year program that we did collectively with European Union. We have immense learning in terms of building capacities of the civil society organization so that they are able to make use of sustainable development goals to influence the private sector, or how do we make private sector more responsible towards sustainable development goal and ensuring business and human rights. Now, with that as the background, the next 1.5 hours will be a lot of conversation, and we'll encourage all the participants joining us today to engage with us, to post your question, and we want to really make it a very open and conversation. So without further ado, I would now like to request Ms. Ranu Bhogal, the Policy Research and Campaigns Director from Oxfam India, to give a welcome and the introduction to the whole event. Over to you, Ranu.
Thanks, Ranjana. And once again, a very warm welcome to all of you. It's a small group, but I think that makes for maybe a very rich conversation. So 1.5 hours of some rich conversation, and I'm keen that we also be more forward-looking in this conversation. It's an opportunity to, of course, assess the 3 years of work where we have produced a lot of interesting material. We have worked with a large number, I think close to 100+ civil society organizations. We have done boot camps, and when we started, this whole business of responsible business was not something most civil society organizations were really clued into, especially if you go into spaces that go beyond the metros of India. And I think this project gave us a fantastic opportunity to also connect with the players in the European continent. And, I think the unfortunately COVID happened, and therefore we had to really modify a lot of what we had planned to do. Yet I think the project has helped us to create a fairly good stock of material, podcasts, modules, toolkits. And going forward, I'm sure we will be able to socialize that further, because Oxfam has an ongoing program on the issues of especially informal sector workers. And we know that in case of India, 90% of our workforce is in the informal sector space. So when we talk of business and human rights, one cannot ignore the informal sector workers who are very much part of that ecosystem. So I just want to assure you all that we are committed to, going beyond this project. So with that, I think I would really like to invite, or I have to hand it over back to you, Ranjana, sorry. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I would like this to be a forward-looking conversation as well. Yeah, not just a stock-taking conversation. So thanks a lot. Over to you, Ranjana.
Thank you, Ranu. I think that also sets the context because this was meant to be one of our closure multi-stakeholder dialogue before we are formally taking forward global goals to local impact. So, of course, a forward-looking conversation, and we have a fantastic panel to have discussions around that in the later half of the webinar. One of the aim of this project was also to influence the private sector around sustainable development goals, and to be very particular for sustainable development goals, and to make private sector responsive towards that. One was the SDG 5, which was on gender equity, SDG 8, which was ensuring decent work and economic growth, SDG 10 on reducing inequality, and SDG 16 on peace and justice and in strong institutions. Now, with this as the background and with CSO strengthening as one of the key strategies of this project, I'd like to request Amitav to give a address, because I mean, ever since I have known him an expert on all these things. So over to you, Amitav, and we'd really love to hear from you a bit on the sustainable development goals and its opportunity to, influence the private sector to ensure business and human rights in India.
Sure, thank you, Ranjana. And let me start first by welcoming everyone to this conversation, and also thanking EU for the generous support that they have provided over the years, and a big thanks to all the partners. As I hear from Ranjana, this has been a very successful initiative, largely thanks to all the partners who've really contributed to this. And it was an innovative idea. So, let me try and straight away jump into substance. I'll not go into the details of the project. We have a presentation after this on what the project did. But I'm going to try and raise 3 specific questions, which will hopefully address Ranu's suggestion that while we're addressing what's happening today, we're also being looking at the future. But let me just say, I was in New York when the SDGs were approved. I was in the room in the UN, and it was absolutely electric. The day started with Pope giving a speech, followed by Shakira, and Shakira singing when there were almost 30 to 40 heads of the states, including the Indian Prime Minister. And then we moved on to the actual unveiling of the formal SDG. So it was absolutely electric. But let me say it was also electric because the process, and I was very involved in the process of framing of the SDGs, were a very inclusive process. Unlike MDGs, which many of you would have heard those stories, as in 3 has certainly heard this story from me, that it was a bunker room in the UN where all the MDGs were drafted. Just 4 or 5 experts around a coffee table drafting the MDGs. From there, they moved on to framing the SDGs through a massive process of government, civil society, private sector, trade unions, everybody contributing to this process. And what we did get was a fairly robust global compact, probably the most ambitious global compact we've ever had. But let me say that, that was the electric moment. But very soon, and I continued working on SDGs after that for a couple of years, fairly intensively, when we came back to our countries, we started realizing that either the governments were taking over the responsibility of delivering SDGs, or voluntarily civil society and others were handing it over to the governments. So the coalition that was built of multi-stakeholder coalition, in which state was one of the actors, kind of started diminishing. And that's where I would say that the conversations I've been part of, it's fairly clear that we'll not be able to achieve SDGs if it's just state intervention. It is very, very critical for all of us to try and see how the different stakeholders come together. So this is fantastic that here we are looking at different stakeholders who are at times have a confrontational relationship, trying to work together to achieve SDG goals. So in this context, I wanted to highlight 3 specific questions with the hope and with the expectation that we'll continue to grow the alliance. The idea of, I'm absolutely convinced, and I'm sure everybody here in the room who has looked at the mandate of SDGs, that not one stakeholder can deliver it. So we need combined energies. We actually need people's ownership of the SDGs if you want to move ahead. 3 specific questions that I wanted to ask. One, if you look at the SDGs, there was a significant critique. As I said, I was very involved in the process, but we still critique the process. And one of the critical pieces that I think a lot of global civil society was saying in the SDGs is that it misses a hard human rights framework. What it does is it's moved from MDGs, where it was just extreme poverty and extreme hunger, to a more comprehensive developmental framework, but it does not address the fundamental human rights questions. And I think that's something very, very critical for us to understand. And I'm therefore very delighted that you have picked actually the goals which are probably central for any kinds of human rights intervention. 5, gender justice. 8, decent work. 10, inequality. And 16, which is about justice and governance. So these are 4 very, very critical goals. And without these, we'll not be able to move ahead. But in a way, my first ask of all of us is, how do we move ahead in amplifying and highlighting the human rights threads within the SDGs? How do we amplify that? That's very, very critical. And these 4 goals are the entry to that conversation. Have we done that adequately? I would actually want to look back at this project and see, have we been able to do that? And then to take those threads to the different actors to ensure that the delivery of human rights is comprehensive. So that's the challenge 1 that I was looking at. The second, which is more of an Indian challenge, is Indian civil society has been extremely robust and vibrant over the years. But essentially, the theory of change of Indian civil society has been to work with the state, or to challenge the state, or to try and hold the state accountable. Because state has been the fundamental repository of power. Whereas that story has changed significantly in the last 2 decades. But if you look at civil society, we are very apt in working with the state. As I said, to engaging with the state to hold it accountable, to ask for greater accountability, etc. But our ability to engage with the private sector has been extremely limited, neither in collaborative frameworks, and I would even say neither in confrontational framework. The engagement has been limited. Even our attempts, and I've done a lot of work on the private sector, particularly looking at social impacts, say 15 years ago, but essentially our work was directed towards the state, seeking state's intervention for ensuring businesses and private sector to be human rights compliant, environmentally compliant. So it is a new grammar that needs to be developed, in which we need to find ways of directly engaging. And I'm intentionally using now engaging. Sometimes it would be a confrontational engagement. Sometimes it would be a collaborative engagement. But hopefully, given that at least in this conversation, there is a agreement that we are looking at broadly the same objectives of the SDGs of human rights. But how do we, if we are able to develop that grammar, and that's what Ranjana, I feel that all our work has been able to do, at least sensitize a significant part of civil society to start comprehending how does this conversation happen. So we know how to rush to the station house officer of the police or to the district collector, but we don't know who to go to if it's a company in our vicinity. I think all that conversations will start happening, but it's a significant piece that we'll need to work on. So that's the second. And the third is the final one, the big challenge that I see, that the pandemic has completely reversed whatever little gains we had made. I must say, I would be disappointed with the first 5 years of our performance vis-a-vis SDGs, and not just India, globally, and the data is also showing that. But the pandemic has actually completely crashed whatever the efforts we had made. And we saw the ugly side of how the Indian business sector works, how the labor is treated. The migrant crisis that we saw was heart-wrenching. It was really heartbreaking to see thousands and thousands of people walk in 43 degrees centigrade, 44 degrees centigrade, no water, just going back to their villages because they did not have a place to live in the places where they were employed. They did not get wages. It was a tough story. I know of several business captains in India who were completely alarmed. And we are working with some of them who said that this needs a complete reset. We need to look within. And these are some, Thermex is one of them, very progressive. Many of them are coming forward and saying that we need to look within. Why is this happening? So that's the context where we are. Suddenly, as the UN Secretary General said, the pandemic has been like an X-ray, which has completely exposed the fault lines of societies that we have created. The fault lines of inequality, the fault line, it's a fascinating statement where he says fault lines where we believe that racism is over, where we believe that unpaid care work does not happen, etc., etc. So once the pandemic has exposed this, how do we pedal up our initiatives now to achieve the human rights that we are talking of? In these times of crisis, both happens. The ugly side starts taking over, but there's also a serious opportunity that the good in us actually drives the agenda. So, my invitation to all of us, let's look at these three challenges. Let's see how do we drive the good in all of us, the good in this collaboration collective to actually push for that normative world that we have aspired for, which is human rights compliant, which is environmentally sustainable and ensures a life of dignity for all. Thank you, Ranjana.
Thank you so much, Amitav. And these three questions would remain a critical foundation for the further conversations that we will be having. And the first one that you are actually raising is very critical, that the SDGs misses a human rights framework. And you and I know, and Ranu is here also, that engaging with the private sector in our informal sector work will remain a very critical strategy in the coming years. And on the question of human rights, missing human rights framework in the SDGs, I mean, later on, maybe we'll like to hear from Sean also, who is representing UNDP here today. But before we proceed, just for our participants to say that we, under the global goals to local impact, which will be also one of our foundational work to engage with the private sector with various strategies and tools, we have produced a lot of products under it, like Ranu mentioned, podcasts, reports, videos, and all. And I'll request my colleague Ishita to post the link of our website in the chat box so that all of you can access it also. Some of the participants today have also been a part of our journey in the GGLI program that we have done together with you. So welcome once again. With that, we were actually expecting to bring the European Union perspective on strengthening India and European Union civil society partnerships on sustainable development by the Honorable Ambassador of the European Union to India, His Excellency Mr. Hugo Astuto. However, it's unfortunate that he couldn't be with us today, but he has sent a pre-recorded message, and I will request Dipakshi, if you can kindly play this for all of us to go through what message he has for us.
Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your invitation to address this meeting and to highlight the critical role of civil society and business in the pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Biodiversity Convention, well, these instruments have defined the roadmap towards a better world, which is green, just, and resilient. The achievement of Sustainable Development Goals requires strong and effective international cooperation. And in this respect, I'm happy to recognize here the central role played by India. But it also demands a high level of commitment from all stakeholders worldwide. The actual implementation of Sustainable Development Goals is not only a matter for public authorities, it requires the full participation of civil society and business. The European Union has introduced some significant legislative measures in this respect on business and human rights and for responsible business conduct. EU law, as of today, requires large EU companies to report on non-financial aspects of their operation, and it guarantees the right of victims in cases of human rights violations. And we are now considering to introduce additional legislation on sustainable corporate governance, which would make it mandatory for large EU companies to exert human rights due diligence as well as environmental due diligence across value chains. The crisis today, the COVID-19 crisis, must be an opportunity for faster but also lasting change in Europe, in India, worldwide. When the UN Secretary General says that we must build back better, this definitely also applies to the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. We must together work to achieve gender equality, to promote inclusive and sustainable growth, to promote decent work for all, to reduce inequalities and to achieve a just, peaceful and inclusive society. But this cannot be done without a collective and cohesive effort by the international community, governments, local authorities, together with all stakeholders. So this is where your contribution can be seminal and precious. So let me thank you and extend to you my best wishes for your continued efforts. Thank you very much.
That was quite an encouraging statement. So India also has our own journey of, keeping the foundation of United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. And we have a journey from voluntary guidelines to national guidelines for responsible business conduct. And we have the national action plan also. India's experience on legal and policy front has been, we are excellent in doing policies and laws, but then the implementation remains a challenge. And here Oxfam has always believed that civil society does have a big role to play, whether it remains, as Amitabh said, that being confrontational with government or sitting with the government over the table or challenging or working with the private sector, there should be something we must do together to ensure the informal sector within the business supply chain, that they get their dues of human rights, especially after what we have seen post-pandemic. I mean, yesterday was the day we marked 1 year of the national lockdown, and it has been a tremendous reminder for us that what we have seen, the migrants walking miles to go back to their home, I mean, it should remain to us as a brutal reminder and give us the impetus to come forward together and respond to the question of human rights and informal sector in the coming days. Now, having said that, it's my pleasure to invite my colleagues Ruth and Trinanjan, who have been hand in hand in doing the program of Global Goals to Local Impact. And I once again mentioned that some of the participants have been a part of the journey. So I request Ruth and Trinanjan to take us through what have been our journey through this program. What have been some of the things that we have learned together? What have we been able to produce? How have we strengthened the civil society? And what's the way forward like? And then we will be going over to the fantastic panelists with whom we just can't wait to have the conversation. So over to you, Trinanjan and Ruth.
Thanks, Ranjana. Dipakshi, could you put up the slides, please? Thanks. And Ranjana, how much time do we have for this section? Can't hear you, you're mute.
So you have almost 15 minutes, Trinanjan.
Perfect. So Ruth and I will split this 7 and 7. Hopefully we can stick to that simple math. All right. Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone who has joined us today. This project that we've been speaking about, it's started off as a project, but it's very much part of Oxfam India's program on private sector engagement, and now moving towards, as Anjana mentioned, about informal sector workers. This, in a way, sort of encapsulates all that we plan to do going forward in our new strategy at Oxfam India. This project also has a special place in my heart, simply because I joined, well, 3 years back almost, to sort of begin this project, and I've been with it since the very beginning. And when this project was imagined, the focus was on these 4 goals, and in a way, a lot of the points that I'm going to be talking about in my 7 minutes are something that Amitabh has very succinctly sort of captured them, and in a way, they're kind of pointers for me. I mean, those 3 points that Amitabh mentioned are something that I'm going to be elaborating on as we go forward. Dipakshi, next slide, please. Thanks. As you mentioned, the whole idea of this project, when this project started in 2018, and prior to that, when we were imagining this project, it was what was seen as the norm was that private sector engagement is often seen between an either or kind of a spectrum. Either it's co-option, and there are many sort of ways of that, especially CSR has become the corporate social responsibility angle, has been always a way to sort of, co-option or service delivery, or the other end of the spectrum being a confrontation. But the idea of the global goes to local impact was essentially to explore the spectrum of private sector engagement, and not simply sort of sway between the 2 ends of that spectrum. And in a way, throughout the course of the past 3 years, that has been one of the core guiding principles, to see where do we confront, where do we collaborate, and all the other ways of engaging with stakeholders in the world of SDGs, so that we can positively influence the private sector to be more responsible, more accountable, and more transparent, and contribute towards the sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. And that sort of brings me to one of the core points that Amitabh mentioned, that it is true that the word human rights in the 2030 agenda document that was signed on the 15th of September has only 11 mentions of human rights, and only 1 in the core language of the 17 goals. So in a way, it is true that the focus of SDGs lacks a bit of the human rights perspective, and that's why it's really heartening to see that and it was very astute to actually focus on these 4 SDGs, and not simply often when people think of the role of business, there's a tendency to move towards SDG 12, which is on responsible consumption and production. But I think the reason why we decided to focus on these 4 core aspects of the SDGs is because these also represent one of the most social aspects of the SDGs, where the role and responsibility of businesses is very well encapsulated. I don't think I need to sort of elaborate on on the 4 goals, except that throughout this pandemic, the past 1 year exactly, all 4 of these have been highlighted to such an extent that their importance and relevance vis-a-vis businesses towards towards achieving the SDGs cannot be overemphasized. Whether we're talking about decent work, which includes labor conditions, whether we're talking about gender equality, which talks about apart from unpaid care work, which was a big factor and highlighted throughout this pandemic, or whether we're talking about the inequalities, which in fact were kind of magnified and widened as a course of this pandemic. So these 4 goals have been the focus of this project, as well as Oxfam India's larger program on responsible business. Next slide, please. And in a way, so yeah, and one of the reasons why, I mean, the SDGs became a really useful vehicle to talk about the role of business in SDGs is because, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. You know, while Amitabh mentioned that, you know, the human rights component is sort of, you know, lacks in the SDGs, but the language of SDGs is so encompassing that it also becomes a useful tool for moving away from a confrontational kind of a discourse with businesses to talk about sustainable development, you know, where it doesn't seem too much of a stick, of a human rights stick, but in fact ways of working together to figure out, you know, what works, what doesn't work, and most importantly, why. The SDGs have also, in a way, you know, through the focus of our 4 goals, SDGs has, the project has also tried to push the envelope of, you know, what sustainability means to a lot of businesses, because to a lot of businesses, sustainability still is largely within the realm of the environment and ecology. But the 4 goals that we're talking about have a very core social perspective on understanding what sustainability is. And lastly, I would also say that because of Oxfam's commitment towards, you know, human rights, that we have tried to sort of, you know, put this project, the Global Goals Local Impact, at a juncture between SDGs and business and human rights. In fact, you know, to try to bring the stronger human rights perspective to the discourse on SDGs. Next slide, please. So as I think Ranjana mentioned during the introduction, that this project began in 2018, and it's part of a partnership instrument of the European Union, who've been very kind to firstly accept and then, you know, support us through the past 3 years. And in a way, this is a kind of a unique design, because one of the core components of this project is the exchange between India and Europe. Whether it's in terms of knowledge and know-how between civil society organizations, or multi-stakeholder dialogues between Indian and European companies. But most importantly, this project was implemented jointly between Oxfam India and Oxfam GB, which was still part of the EU, unfortunately not anymore. But and yeah, and as it says here, that, you know, the project sort of, one of its fulcrum lies on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Next slide, please. I think this is something that I've already spoken about, so we can probably skip this. Next. Yes, these are some of the core sort of, well, avenues through which we have intervened through this project. The first idea was about enhancing capabilities and strengthening civil society participation. Again, you know, going back to what Amitabh said, that, you know, despite the rich history of Indian civil society and its sort of, you know, robustness, the question of how to engage with non-state actors has always been a bit of, you know, a challenge for a lot of Indian civil society organizations. So in a way, this was kind of, you know, a foray into understanding, as I said earlier, the spectrum of engagement and how to sort of, you know, where to sort of put the pressures, where to sort of find synergies and opportunities of engagement to strengthen accountability. Another core aspect, as I mentioned earlier as well, is promoting collaboration and exchange between European and Indian civil societies, organizations. And you know, we've built community of practice. We've you know, jointly produced audiovisual learning modules, and more of that Ruth, my colleague, will sort of, you know, give more details. But a lot of the work, the core workshops that we did, was to inculcate this kind of a collaboration and exchange of knowledge, know-how, expertise, experiences between European and Indian civil society. And part of it is also because European civil society organizations have had a longer history of engaging with business and private sector towards questions of human rights, sustainability, and in a way, for a lot of Indian NGOs, this is a kind of a newer, relatively newer space for engagement. So there was a lot of learning and exchange that really sort of benefited the project and the partners with whom we worked. Multi-stakeholder dialogues, this is one of them, but we've had a few of these in the past where we've had food and agriculture companies, we've had large scale Indian MNCs who've been also part of the conversation, again to sort of not sway between co-option and collaboration, but actually through dialogue explore the spectrum of private sector engagement. And the innovative and learning exchange processes, this I will not elaborate because I know Ruth will when she talks about the different kind of activities and outputs that we've created, which I feel have a much long-term relevance and longevity well beyond the time frame of this project. With that, I will now hand it over to Ruth. Thanks.
Thank you, Tree. Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. My name is Ruth Mplanga and I'm based in Oxford in the UK, and I've been the project lead for Global Goals, working with colleagues in India and across Europe as well. If you could head over to the next slide. I think the thing to start and really emphasize here is that this has always been an exchange. This has never been a top-down learning, and particularly, taking that onus of from global goals to local impact. It has always been about how can we ensure that international NGOs are talking to local organizers, or talking to grassroots mobilizers, and how can we make sure that information is moving between parts of civil society as well as with business and government. And for us, that is, I think, the proudest moment for this project, which is the community of practice that we've created and the network of NGOs that we've managed to create. And as we've talked, come to the end of this project, we believe that that will be the strongest legacy of this project, which is how we've brought together all these different actors and their ability to then take it forward and continue to work together to tackle some really pertinent issues. And as we say, almost need to try and reset the clock, given the impact that COVID has had. And so for us, the approach has always been, this is an exchange. This is civil society coming together to tackle issues, both at a global level, but also right down at a local level. Next slide. So in terms of the different tools, we right from the get-go wanted to be as innovative as possible. And this is part of us trying to be as inclusive. So we created everything from tools that people could use as individuals, like the handbooks, the compendium, which people could use as resources. We had workshops. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in New Delhi in the opening workshops, where again, we had over 80 people in a room having discussions, sharing ideas. The student dialogues were incredibly powerful in terms of bringing the next generation of business leaders into the conversation. The mentor program, for example, has been really instrumental in doing some deep dives into some key issues. So part of this range of tools has been about us being as inclusive as possible, but also ensuring that we are engaging as many people as possible in the most creative ways as possible throughout this project. Next slide, please. So some really key highlights from the project, which we keep banging on about. So in terms of the AV modules, these have been for us a real coup in the sense that having these open source digital multimedia learning resources is incredibly important as we sort of move away not just from traditional teaching methods, but we're also providing information in a format that makes it more accessible for people, as any of these slides and videos can be shared via WhatsApp, and therefore increasing accessibility to NGOs who might not be as well resourced, as well as the need for people to work remotely. And so therefore we're not necessarily needing all to come together. These resources remain flexible and can be used. And again, that issue of being open access. Our online mentoring sessions, as I said, have been incredibly important in terms of deep dives into the nitty-gritty of issues around business and human rights, decent work, as well as issues of gender equality. And that's really allowed the experts to come together and say, how can we tackle the challenges that we're seeing here? In terms of our courses on business and human rights, We've managed to bring together experts from India and Europe to really look at the different aspects of this. And for example, our virtual course attracted over 7,000 participants from 50 countries. Our community of practice has had over 300 CSOs coming together to share information, knowledge, and know-how, and build capacity of community activists. And again, as I said, if there's the thing that we're most proud of and we can walk away from this project is that legacy of bringing all these people together. And you'll see from the range of photos on the screen that at different times we've managed to bring different groups of people together. And right at the bottom there in the center is all of us gathered in New Delhi at the start of this project. And you'll see at the bottom right of the screen, unfortunately, is us gathering again virtually because the pandemic no longer allowed us to meet together in various rooms. Next slide, please. So as I said, I think one of the things that we walk away from, as we go into and we look forward in this journey is that increased dialogue that has happened between European and Indian civil society as we've learned from each other what works, what doesn't work. We've also managed to strengthen some multi-stakeholder dialogue, and we hope again that this morning, as you hear from different perspectives, whether that is from business or from NGOs, that will continue to be taken forward as a legacy of this project. Next slide, please. So just again to acknowledge the impact that COVID had on this project, and towards the tail end of the pandemic, we had to tweak some of the aspects of the project. So while we had planned to gather together in Europe for the final stage of the project, and in fact, today we probably all would have been together in a room, we've obviously had to change this. The good side is that it made us more innovative, and we've had some wonderful exchanges online, and we've had to reformat that. But just to acknowledge the fact that we do recognize we've had some restrictions as a result of COVID, but that hasn't stopped us from getting together, from continuing these learning exchange. And I sincerely hope going forward that these sort of platforms will remain accessible to everyone to allow these conversations to continue. Next slide, please. So I won't go too deeply into this, but maybe just as a way to kind of flag what the panelists are going to be talking to you about, which is there's so much more work to do. And while we're incredibly proud of what this project has achieved over the 3 years, as it has already been highlighted, COVID has set us back. And so there's going to need to re-energize civil society, re-energize business, and we look forward to some of the opportunities, whether that is European legislation, and we'll hear from Mark Dern from the Core Coalition about the work that is happening there, whether it's national action plans in India, and we'll get to hear both from the business perspective as well as from business and human rights practitioners on this, about what are the opportunities and what are the challenges as we move forward. Next slide. Thank you very much from myself and Tree, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this morning.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Tree. And while I was going through the slides, I was feeling a bit emotional also, because since last June, I have also been a part of Global Goals to Local Impact. Not to say so, I think I and Tree worked very closely when we did a learning lab in Patna. I was then in the state of Bihar. And if some of the participants are joining us, do share with us what have been, if you have been ever a part of the learning labs or our community of practice, which is a huge online platform that we have been able to create. Do share with us your experience and how are we planning to take this collaboration forward. It's absolutely fantastic to see how civil society has come together to make an understanding of the sustainable development goals, to understand human rights issues and work towards sustainability. It's indeed heartening to see. Two of the things will remain very significant, along with all the materials and products that we have produced, will be the community of practice, and we will ensure that it remains vibrant, grow, and become a critical critique of business and human rights in the coming days. Last year, we did a business and human rights course, and Ruth, as you rightly mentioned, we saw tremendous participation from all across the globe. This actually shows that somewhere we have been able to create a momentum, and here onwards, we should be taking this forward. So thanks a lot. Going forward, as I said, and I must make an appeal to those of you who are joining us, please do send in your comments. And then we now would like to start the panel discussion. And as I said in the beginning, that we are joined by a fantastic panel today. So without further ado, I must introduce the panel, and then we will hear from each of the panelists a 7 to 8 minutes intervention on a specific broad question that I will be asking them, and then opening up to the audience to have a more open interaction with all of them. So let me take the honor to introduce the panel today. Joining us today is Rijit Sengupta, CEO of Center for Responsible Business in India. Mark Dane, Director, Core Coalition in UK, Shaw Lees, Business and Human Rights Specialist, UNDP, and Joel Fernandez, Associate Director, Europe, European Business and Technology Center. So I would like to begin with Rijit. Rijit, we have been collaborating together for the past few months, on our SMT supply chain work, and it has been a pleasure to work. So here is a very open and a little broad question to you, whether you take it as a simple question or a challenging one, up to you, how you respond to it. But at this juncture of time, when the pandemic is happening, a lot India has seen, as I said, a journey on business and human rights, sustainability, SDGs. What are some of the opportunities that you are right now seeing bringing more sustainable, I mean, if we have to walk a bit towards a sustainable development in terms of role of private sector, government, CSOs together? I'm posing this to you because CRB does play a critical role in bringing stakeholders together. So some of your opening comments, and just to remain a bit practical, you have 7 to 8 minutes in hand. You can go a little beyond that also. And some of your comments can also be provocative, Bridget, to our participants also to participate and engage with you. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Ranjana. And at the outset, thanks for the opportunity and the invitation. Very happy to be here. Your question is, what are the emerging opportunities for businesses with regards to human rights and SDGs? And I think to answer the question unprovocatively, I'll talk about the opportunities, and to probably provoke a little bit, I'll also maybe put some challenges in the footnote. So as far as the opportunities are concerned, and I'm going to share my thoughts in the context of the project, which is basically a conversation between the things that are happening in the European Union and the developments here in India, which I think are very interesting. And I think there are broadly two opportunities. The first is that the ecosystem, there's an emerging enabling ecosystem. So that's an opportunity, and I'll come to that, explain it a little better. And secondly, the pathways to business case, especially for the private sector, are also emerging as an opportunity. So if I may come to the first one, which is basically, why do I say that the enabling system is emerging? I'll break it down into two parts. First, talk about the domestic jurisdiction and whatever is happening in India, and I'll talk perhaps about the government to start with, because the government has been a fairly driver as far as some of these issues are concerned for several years now, and we see that consistently being applied. So at the national level, the government of India is taking a number of steps, to sort of create that overall enabling environment in which a conversation, and not just a conversation, but also action on business and human rights and on sustainability, sustainable development goals can happen. And I will highlight four of those opportunities. First is the new disclosure framework, taking the opportunity perhaps to do some of the work that the Ministry of Commerce should be doing, which is to highlight and create a larger awareness about the business responsibility and sustainability reporting framework. And I'm aware that Shankar is the board chair of Oxfam, has also been part of that process, as some of us have been. So that's one. The disclosure framework is available, and the interesting thing there is that there is a, in addition to, it is also aspirational. So in addition to large companies, it also talks about SMEs, of creating opportunity for SMEs to start engaging in this journey. Secondly, also, as you are aware, and it's perhaps useful to let everybody know, that the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights is also at an advanced stage, and the government, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, with UNDP is also working on it, and it's likely to be released within this year. Thirdly, the Niti Aayog, which till recently has been engaged, well, the SDG custodian for India in terms of the overall architecture and the framework is concerned. Until recently, they have been engaged only looking at what the states have been doing, and there is a state in this index. The latest one is coming up, this year. It will be this month. It will be released, hopefully. But now what Niti Aayog is also doing is it is also moving into the space where they're trying to figure out what could be the possible ways for businesses to contribute to the SDGs. Very happy to share with you that CRB actually contributed a paper which then eventually got picked up in India's Voluntary National Review of the SDGs 2020, which Niti Aayog presented at the HLPF last year in New York. And that talked about for the first time the various pathways through which businesses have always been contributing and could contribute to the SDGs. The fourth one, and this is fairly new, and I'm also aware that EU has been involved there as well, is that there is a process that has been initiated of developing sort of a conversation and also some sort of action on sustainable finance by the Ministry of Finance, and CRB is part of the working group that is working on the taxonomy on the EU, and there we see a great opportunity. Again, you talked about opportunities. In all of these are opportunities for civil society, for think tanks, for individuals to highlight the importance of sustainable business, specifically, issues pertaining to human rights. I'll very quickly talk about the last one, which is the EU sort of the taxonomy on sustainable finance. If you look at the EU taxonomy, it is primarily on the green side. So there's basically the environmental elements that are talked about. But when we are talking about a taxonomy that represents the realities in the context of India, and some of us are sort of have recommended that equal amount of sort of emphasis should be also given on the social sustainability part, workers, informal sector, communities, and so on. So just to say that the enabling ecosystem is emerging in spite of the fact that this was a pandemic year. I think, some credit is due to those organs of the government that they have pushed it and have been able to do a fair amount of work on those 3-4 areas. Now, in terms of so this is the domestic jurisdiction. What does it does it imply for on trade and investment processes? So some of the important trade the opportunities there are for sustainable, what we are calling at CRB sustainable competitiveness or competitive sustainability, whichever way you want to look at it. Some of the important trade and investment partners of India are coming up with their home country regulation, and this has been happening for some time now already, whether the Netherlands, Germany, France, etc. Joel is here and he knows about it from EBTC, and this has implications for suppliers, manufacturers, producers, international competitiveness. So there is a need for, and it can be perhaps construed as a challenge, but it can probably be even flipped over as an opportunity with some sort of capacity building that can probably come in from the bilateral partners And I'm reminded of some sort of an instrument that EU had developed, and Anilji is here also from the EU, which basically talked about aid for trade, and there was this initiative called the European Development Fund. The European Development Fund, which was basically for the ACP, Africa, and the Caribbean and the Pacific, was basically to improve the capacity of these countries to trade better. So why can't EU, for example, or some of the bilaterals come up with something similar, a sustainability development fund? And we know that there is a sort of a rescue and resilience initiative that has recently been set up at EU, which can perhaps also support the country's ambition, especially the ones which are important trade and investment partners, to trade sustainably better. So that's one, sort of quick footnote of a recommendation in the garb of talking about the opportunities. I'll also talk about very quickly the business case. So the first opportunity was the enabling ecosystem. The second opportunity is the business case for the pathways for business case. I mean, as I said, I think just to sum up, regulatory requirements, both domestically and globally, are there for. Secondly, investors' preference are changing. Globally, we are seeing a number of the amount of ESG finance. The volume has really sort of gone through the roof in terms of if you track the numbers. And investors are looking for fungible projects, companies, investments, initiatives that can be looked at. Non-financial disclosures are, have been always there. The GRI, the integrated reporting, et cetera, and also consumer preference is changing. I mean, Deloitte studies are there for the last 2 years, which talks about consumers moving from companies which are huge and profit-oriented to companies which are more purposeful. I mean, Davos is a great example where there has been. I mean, Amitabh was there, and he probably bear with me. There was a change in the air, where there was talk about stakeholder capitalism as compared to issues very central to business engagement. So I think I'll rest my case there. I know I'm out of time, but in terms of your question number one, which was about the emerging opportunities, these are some of my thoughts that I wanted to put on the table. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rijit. Thank you for laying out so well about some of the opportunities that India right now have, and also opening up a case of collaboration with the international fora as well. And also this whole case of ESG and the investor angle is something, a very critical window, and we must harness to it to influence the investors as well to move towards a more sustainable economy and more sustainable development. So thanks a lot. I wouldn't dive because you have very well articulated where lies the opportunities. I will now quickly move to Mark. Mark, as a representative of Core Coalition UK, which has been working very critically to bring, to influence the government, to influence the private sector. If you can kindly, two things to you. One is, what has been Core Coalition's central role to protect the case of business and human rights, and where do you see an opportunity to bring government, private sector, and CSOs together to push for this case? If you can touch upon this a bit. So over to you, Mark.
No, I'm unmuted. I'll be speaking much more to the current situation in the UK and Europe as regards the evolving situation around business and human rights. And of course, post-Brexit, as a UK organisation, our focus is now necessarily much more on the UK, but we remain very much closely engaged with our EU partners. And I should add that I was also involved in the SDGs for civil society groups from Rio+20 in 2012 through the ensuing what was called high-level panel process. And the only thing I'd add to what's already been said is that what human rights are included in the SDGs were not gifted. Civil society groups played a key role in demanding those rights. And I think that reflects a long history of our rights being won and not given. So for CORE, we're the UK's long-standing corporate accountability network. and we've been calling for advances in corporate accountability laws in the UK and EU for more than 20 years, and that's really our fundamental role. We have more than 50 partner organisations spanning NGOs, of course, including Oxfam, trade unions and law firms, and since our founding, we've been involved in championing legislation, including the UK's 2006 Companies Act, which brought in the idea of stakeholder obligations, the EU's 2014 Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and the UK 2015 Modern Slavery Act's Transparency in Supply Chains provision. So I want to begin by giving a conceptual generational framing of corporate accountability laws to help locate our call for a new UK law. So in 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were unanimously approved, which alongside the well-known 3 pillars of obligations included a call for the adoption of mandatory human rights due diligence by business. And notably, it also called on states to explore civil, administrative and criminal liability and for a smart mix of policies to achieve its aims. However, we would argue that the access to justice pillar, which is vital for the frontline communities suffering abuses of rights, has been left behind. And we haven't seen the called for smart mix of policies, as opposed to the domination of voluntary approaches. However, this is now changing and increasingly quickly. So from about 6 years ago, we've seen slowly improving legislation over 3 generations. From a first generation of supply chain transparency or reporting laws, such as the UK's Modern Slavery Act from 2015, through to second generation laws calling for the identification of human rights risks in supply chains and acting to mitigate them. The Dutch child labour due diligence law is an example of that. And a third generation of laws linking this to corporate legal liability for abuses. So there's the 2016 French Duty of Vigilance law, and as previously mentioned, very significantly, the EU's new mandatory human rights due diligence law announced last year with a supportive statement from a number of businesses and to be tabled by the EU in June 2021. And in 2021 alone, so far, laws have been proposed in the Netherlands, Austria and Germany, all of which can be classed as second or third generation laws within this framework. So where are we in the UK and how has the EU's call and significantly our own UK common law developments influenced this? So for the UK and all non-EU countries, in fact, the EU's proposed law at present presents something of a complex situation. So for level playing field reasons, as it stands, the EU law will apply to all businesses operating in the single market, regardless of domicile. And what they mean by operating is selling goods, services, or having a presence there. So that creates a 2-tier system in non-EU states with such businesses operating in the EU. Some will be required to follow this obligation and others will not, those that don't operate in the EU. The EU's desire to create a level playing field for its businesses thus creates an uneven playing field in other states, and correspondingly, a powerful business-facing rationale for those jurisdictions to follow suit. In the UK, a 2017 cross-parliamentary committee called for our government to introduce a new corporate accountability law based on provisions in the UK Bribery Act, under which businesses can face legal liability for failing to prevent bribery. This law would be a strict liability law. That means businesses would, crucially, face liability when a proven harm happens in operations they control, but they would have a defense of showing they did everything they reasonably could to prevent harm from happening. As transposed to human rights, that defense would be the conduct of adequate or reasonable human rights due diligence. Subsequent to this, we've had 2 landmark cases at the UK Supreme Court involving abuses suffered in Zambia and Nigeria related to subsidiaries of UK parent companies, Vedanta and Shell respectively. And in both of those cases, we acted as an intervener. And together, these cases clarified that UK parent companies can have a duty of care for the actions of their overseas subsidiaries. And after the first of these in 2019, we launched our campaign for a new law in the UK based on the legal formulation I've just described. But one of the major problems we faced is that many UK decision makers think our first generation Modern Slavery Act law is enough. However, in the wake of scandals around the UK garment company Boohoo and the Uyghur situation in China, figures including the UK's Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, the opposition Labour Party, and a parliamentary committee focused on the Uyghur situation have all argued that the Modern Slavery Act is not fit for purpose in stopping the forced labour supply chain abuses it was created to deal with, let alone other human rights or environmental harms. So what is our role within this as a CSO platform? At this moment, the role of civil society organizations is vital. We are the ones who can tie together the needs of people and communities and the lack of a level playing field for responsible business with advocacy to politicians and the movement building in society that can only empower this. And that's precisely what we are doing, targeting legislative change by 2024, against a backdrop of an unsupportive government, but an emerging consensus in other spheres of politics and society. And that includes progressive businesses. And I think it's important to note here the need for governments to get their own houses in order, that public procurement supply chains must not be excluded from this conversation. So I can only speak to the European situation here, but for us, it's clear that there's a societal shift only enhanced by what's happening during COVID. People increasingly understand what supply chains are, something also helped by Brexit in the UK. They've seen the scandals, including around garment workers in Asia, and they don't want supply chain abuses in the goods or services they buy. They want a world that is fairer and greener, neither of which can meaningfully happen without addressing business and human rights. So to conclude, I want to give a cautionary reminder that due diligence laws of the kind we're calling for are not a panacea or a silver bullet for solving the problems of business and human rights. In 2008, the architect of the United Nations Guiding Principles, Professor John Ruggie, effectively spoke to the need to rebalance the relationship between the state, business, and society in order to stop corporate abuses of rights, or as we would frame it, corporate impunity for abuses of rights. Ahead of the UNGPs, he said that the key reason why business abuses of rights continue is due to the governance gaps between the scope and impact of economic actors and the capacity of society to absorb them. This led to what Ruggie called a permissive environment. Without eradicating this permissive environment, these abuses will continue, and we must continue to question whether what we call for and how that may eventually be transposed into a law will do this at the fundamental level necessary. If it does not, these abuses will continue, and if they do, we will not achieve the overarching SDG aim captured in its preamble of realizing the human rights of all. And I hope that's dealt with. There were two questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. I mean, thank you so much to be very usefully putting down the 3-generation laws, and I wouldn't dare to even articulate it because you've already laid down it. The key takeaway is the point that you are making, that due diligence is not a panacea, where all the governance lapse, where we need to probably work together and then keep challenging the businesses and the government to make the lives of informal sector or the workers who are in the supply chain would be the key takeaway from what I hear from you. So thanks a lot. I quickly come to Sean now. So Sean, a very straight question to you, and also taking cue from what Mark just presented as well. If you can just share with us the key policy developments in India and Europe to ensure human rights while doing business, and how effective are they to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal agenda? A bit broad, but we'd like to hear you. And also, if you want to also give a response to what Amitav began with, that the SDGs are also silent on the human rights and all.
Oh,
so over to you, Sean.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ranjana. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for having me today. A really rich discussion right off the bat. And of course, expecting nothing less with Amitabh opening up for us and remarks from Ambassador Hugo there. You know, in terms of a quick reaction to Amitabh's opening, indeed, I never felt that the SDGs and the linkage with human rights was ever made. I think Madam Pillay, as much as I respected her work, and she really leveraged that role as a human rights commissioner as much as any in recent years, I think she missed an opportunity to really ground the SDGs in human rights. I think she took it for granted what we all feel, that you can't have sustainable development without human rights, and all these targets and indicators that they are coming up with. In fact, were already pre-existing obligations in states, or many were. And in fact, Danish Institute of Human Rights, as many of you know, did a study, maybe it was 2 years back, showing that 92% of the targets could be linked to pre-existing duties of states, could be linked to human rights instruments. And so it's obvious to us. It needs to be more obvious to business. And so I appreciate the ambassador's opening statements. In particular, we need more messaging from people like him that are linking the SDGs to human rights. And we need more messaging too that he gave us today on the need for more cooperation between CSOs and business around sustainable development. A final comment I might make is that recently the UN found that indeed we've really crashed out on SDG progress, as I think Amitabh had put it. Only 10% of the targets, we're only on track to achieve 10% of the targets for the SDGs. That means 17 out of 169 are we on track to meet by 2030. That's just completely unacceptable. We have a lot more work to do, but again, as others have said, we can't get there without business. And so the trick is to link these human rights obligations that states have through perhaps the UN guiding principles to impose upon and work in collaboration with businesses to help us meet those SDGs. So I'll open up with that at your invitation, Ranjana. And I do have some slides to answer your question. Let me see if the slides don't come up immediately, then I'll just talk through them. Sometimes Zoom gets wonky on me. Do you see PowerPoint slide opening?
Yes.
Great. Okay, let me just, oops. Okay, there's the opening. Here we are. Okay, just a real quick background. I promise not to bore you with project or program details, but we are in partnership ourselves with the EU on a business and human rights project called Enabling Sustainable Economic Development in Asia. Our North Star, so to speak, is to have at least 7 countries in Asia to fully embrace the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And as many of you know, some people translate as developing national action plans, but it's certainly not the only thing that we are concerned with in India, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Mongolia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. We're doing a number of different things in the various countries. My colleague Nusrat Khan, who's our business and human rights focal point in India and in this meeting today, is your go-to in India with regards to business and human rights. And I encourage you to reach out to her. She's just joined us, but she's excellent and has come up to speed very quickly. The other thing I want to point attention to is that we are going to be starting regional work on environment and human rights. So business and human rights and the environmental dimension. In fact, we've launched a survey recently trying to get more people like yourselves to help us shape the next generation of programming around climate change and human rights and its impact on human rights, the environment, environmental degradation and human rights. So look out for that survey, and we'll make sure that that your audience here today is linked into that. Also upcoming and attuned with the recent developments in Europe around mandatory human rights due diligence, we'll be making a training facilitation guide on human rights due diligence made publicly available to the general public. Well, publicly available to the general public, a little bit redundant there. Perhaps I'll slow down a bit and just outline what I'd like to say, I'd like to speak to today. The first is on the policy developments in India and Europe. And I'm going to suggest that we do see some convergence between developments in Europe around mandatory human rights due diligence and trade action. I think it's inadvertent, but there is an interesting convergence happening. There's also interesting convergence between human rights due diligence in Europe and their national action plans, which are being launched in several countries in Asia. So key term here is convergence, but perhaps with a question mark. Is it really convergence or is it merely convenience? A second thing I'd like to talk about is the avenues for influencing business, government, and other stakeholders, as we've seen so far from a regional perspective, where and how, and I'll try to do that in a creative manner. I'm not sure it's going to work. Let's find out. Okay, first, I won't go into the details about mandatory human rights due diligence. Materials are out there, and that's already been covered quite, some of the elements of that have already been covered quite well by the previous speaker, our panelist. But I think it's important to note just how wide the support for human rights due diligence seems to be in Europe right now. It's not a top-down effort. It's not like the first generation of national action plans that came out of Europe. The mandatory human rights due diligence bill, I've been told, garnered 75% support according to a national poll. You have business, civil society, trade unions, and consumers in support of this bill. It's not yet to be passed. We'll see what its final look is, but as it currently stands, there's going to be large administrative penalties at stake, and also the loss of procurement opportunities with the state if companies are found to be violating the terms of this bill and or human rights, conducting human rights abuses without remedy elsewhere. It's confined to the largest companies, 3,000 employees or more initially, but it will require them to publish annually, not just on their human rights risks, but what they're doing about it. So it's very similar to the French Due Diligence Act. They will also have to report on how what impact they're having. I think it was also mentioned that this kind of legislation is happening elsewhere in Europe, and you'll see a short list there where the action is. Notably, though, Switzerland, you'll recall, did not pass its referendum there on human rights due diligence. March 10th, we saw the EU Parliament present a suggested language for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation there. I found it interesting. It was actually much broader. I think a lot of people would agree it's much broader than they imagined it would be, including not just human rights, but environmental issues and corruption, good governance issues. We're happy to see that. Civil liability is outlined there. Also, requirement for grievance mechanisms. That and that small and medium-sized enterprises would also be captured by this new legislation is important, albeit there are some limitations there. For example, the SMEs must be listed, and only those SMEs in high-risk areas are required to report. Also goes all the way through the value chain. It's not limited to tier 1 as we're seeing in the human rights due diligence bill out of Germany. I hope I'm not providing too much detail. Really, I just want to suggest that there's a lot of work to work with here. I think we're on the right track. And I'm usually a skeptic. As we'll find out in June, though, when the European Commission comes back. I understand it could take up to 18 more months, though, from June before a final draft is not presented, but is announced. And then after that, the states will ratify according to their own processes. So we're saying it's going to be a couple of years out before this thing really gets in play. It's really in play in a very real way with impact. So that's the European mandatory human rights due diligence legislation bit. Now let's turn a little bit to the NAP development in Asia. Some panelists spoke to the, I think Rijit spoke to the Indian NAP. I always forget the different components, but I'm happy to say that Nusrat provided me on the phone a breakdown of what she's seen so far. So that the NAP in India is ongoing indeed. As from what we see, it's going to cover labor, environment, land acquisition, gender, data protection and privacy, perhaps. There might be a section on mandatory or human rights due diligence. I don't think that's as hot a topic as it once was. State-owned enterprises and their role, their leadership role will be also presented. Public procurement as well. Perhaps these details are known by some of you already, but I find it fascinating. There's a long list of thematic topic areas that are under discussion in the storied rooms or the August rooms of the MCA at this time. If there isn't human rights due diligence outlined in the National Action Plan, that's not what's the word I'm looking for? It's not really dispositive because the national guidelines on responsible business conduct, as you well know, contains some robust language on human rights due diligence, encouraging companies to undertake human rights due diligence. And it would be in step with the other national action plans that we're seeing in Asia at this time. The Thailand NAP, for example, the language mirrors in some ways the national guidelines on RBC, just encouraging the business sector to embrace human rights due diligence. The Pakistan NAP draft, which was, I think, published maybe 2 weeks ago or a week ago, also has human rights due diligence provisions there as well. Many are suggesting that the NAP, introducing human rights due diligence through either a NAP or through national guidelines, such as India's MCA has presented, is that first step to mandatory human rights due diligence, or a big step towards it. And so if we have EU developments on the one side and the NAP developments in Asia on the other, I think I would suggest that we're seeing some convergence there. Again, it's inadvertent. There's no giant hands behind the scenes pulling strings. It is just the general trend. It's consumer expectations rising, investor pressure, shareholder pressure, and of course pressure from civil society. Now, the other side of there's human rights due diligence. There's also trade action, and this is what's really. I think it's an untapped area. I think it's a place that the UN and CSOs, others need to be more, I don't know, articulate in. I notice that it's hard for me to articulate my thoughts around this as I say it. I really do see a lot of potential to the EU's new trade policy, this open, sustainable, and assertive trade policy, as they like to call it. Open strategic autonomy is at the center of their new trade policy. And of course, that attitude and that robustness is a product of the COVID-19 experience, where they felt left out in the cold in some cases. Whether that was fair or not is another, but left out in the cold with regards to critical materials that they thought should be more at the ready. This talk of shorter supply chains, of more resilient supply chains. What it means is that the EU is going to spend more time ensuring that trade reflects their values and reflects their strategic needs. So I've cut out a quote from this trade policy, which came out only a month ago, February 10th or 11th. They want to shape the world around it through leadership and engagement. I mean, don't we all? But they do have a lot of leverage there as one of the third largest market in the world, if I'm not mistaken. They've done a really great job in increasing the level of attention placed on hazardous chemicals, the attention placed on currently on carbon emissions. Lots of work going on at the EU that we are hoping to combine our efforts at the UN with to ensure that the baseline of behavior in business operations is lifted, or is at least minimally maintained in alignment with international human rights standards. The other thing I'd like to mention, I know that this is about India and Europe, but it's what's going on in the US. Over the year 2020, I think the United States issued withhold release orders in numbers they've never seen before, historically high numbers of what are called withhold release orders. That's basically the Customs and Enforcement Agency getting wind of forced labor in a batch of goods that have landed in port, and then stopping those goods at the port and sending them back. They hit China maybe 12 times and Malaysia 3 times in 2020. And they hit some big companies too, FGV, Sime Darby, Top Glove in Malaysia, for example. And that really got Malaysian businesses concerned. That was a very immediate bottom line attack on their business. And it was because of allegations, credible allegations of forced labor. So that's given new impetus to their designs on a national action plan, new energy, more engagement from civil society. Things are trending in the right direction in Malaysia. I won't go into much more detail about Malaysia, but it's a really fascinating context to be watching right now. Lastly, and again, this involves more than just the EU or India here, but the fact that the EU, US, UK, and Canada have come together to place sanctions on certain individuals in a very powerful country in our region is a reflection of a more coordinated approach on trade in human rights or business in human rights. And I think it also signals a trend. Again, trade action is an area, a very powerful area to watch and to get behind. Okay, the second big point, how do we influence business, governments, and other stakeholders? If it's not how, it's also who and when and where. I don't have all the answers, and I can already feel I'm speaking too much. But I thought I would look at what human rights due diligence regulations, what the options are under the heading of human rights due diligence regulations, and suggesting a different way of looking at how to influence governments and businesses and stakeholders. So some of the toughest proposals for human rights due diligence legislation involve civil and criminal penalties. That means we need to get up to speed the lawyers, the judges, legal academics on business and human rights, on UN guiding principles in particular perhaps, but and also work with ministries of justice and courts in general, and to really build capacity. So how do we influence government? It's by working with this group. And I'm sad to say that at UNDP, we don't currently have those linkages and that invitation to work with them. Of course, that might change depending upon the human rights due diligence legislation. Also, a lot of new legislation is linked to procurement contracts. So we're being invited to speak more with the export-import banks. We're getting much more, like in Indonesia, a lot more engagement from the Ministry of Planning, Bapanas, because they are key ministries with regards to control over procurement. Of course, Parliament's an obvious one under that heading. Reporting requirements and directors' duties, things of this nature. This is actually surprisingly low-hanging fruit. Securities and Exchange Commission in Thailand, for example, of course, your SEBI in India too is very interested in what's required for reporting, making that more robust, linking it to due diligence legislation and/or how it's outlined in a national action plan is one way of really giving getting traction with these organizations. The rest is pretty obvious. You know, where when we have voluntary guidance or voluntary requirements, it's really up to us to beat the drum and to ensure consumer pressure and stakeholder pressure is at its maximum, because we won't be able to rely so much on the other levers of power to ensure alignment with the guiding principles. The focus here really has been on government. I recognize that now. But there are other things, of course. Those business incentives were outlined pretty well by Rijit, focusing on reputational risks and building case studies always into our publications and our communications, focusing too on ESG investing and the need to provide better definition, including maybe a requirement that human rights due diligence be undertaken by companies before they're included in an ESG asset class, but also engaging in the discussion around divestment where that's safe to do so. And then lastly, and there's mixed feelings about this, but the tying the human rights agenda more closely to climate change and climate emergency discussions is also a winning proposition according to some. We're exploring that now, as I said in the beginning, with our human rights and environment survey, which I hope you will take time to fill out in the future. Thank you very much. That's a mouthful. Please contact me if you have any questions and/or would like to get a copy of that survey. I appreciate the time very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. And that was tremendously informative. And I'm sure those who are attending and listening to you will find it very useful. If required, we might reach out to you for the presentation. Trade action is something to look forward to, as well as, of course, the human rights due diligence, which is unfolding also. I'm not going to delay further and straight come to Joel because there's a little paucity of time, but I don't want to cut Joel over here. Joel, a straight question to you, keeping the SDG 16 in the backdrop, where institutions play a very significant role, how do you see a role of multi-stakeholder initiative, you know, in ensuring business and human rights, and also making SDGs possible for, or private sector respond to SDGs? So.
Sure. Thanks, Ranjana, and thanks everyone for having me here this morning. First of all, congratulations to the Oxfam team, both in the UK and India, as well as the European Union, for a very fantastic 3 years and for the work that you've been doing on the EU-India corridor. My name is Joel Fernandez, and I'm the Associate Director Europe for the European Business and Technology Center, which is a not-for-profit registered in India. And it used to be an EU-funded project similar to what you at GGLI have been doing in terms of supporting EU businesses to enter India and focus on the clean technology sectors. This was in 2008. And ever since 2016, we transitioned into a not-for-profit organization based in India, again, focusing on the clean and sustainability sectors and advising EU businesses on what are the challenges and opportunities in India and how we can create platforms and give EU businesses a voice through these platforms in terms of the SDGs and other initiatives done between the EU and India. In 2019, we were awarded the Business Support to the EU-India Policy Dialogues project. I will talk more about that because I'm the project lead for that project since 2019, and I'm based in Brussels. This was just to give you an understanding of EBTC, but I would very quickly want to share with you more information on the business support to the EU-India Policy Dialogues project. With EBTC, we also create EU-India clusters, which are sectorial clusters. And I think this is also a group where we invite businesses, and Sean very clearly mentioned the importance of business and civil society and government coming together. So we try to create these clusters for EU businesses, which are already established in India. Very quickly to talk about the business support to the EU-India Policy Dialogues project. It was launched in 2019. EBTC is a consortium partner of that project, along with GFA Consulting and Eurochambers. I sit out of the Eurochambers office here in Brussels. And what we do is we strive to increase the business involvement in strategic areas of partnership between EU and India. And we try and bring the businesses to work on several projects that the EU and India have currently established within India. For example, the Clean Energy and Climate Partnership Project, the EU-India Water Partnership, the ICT Standardization Collaboration, the EU-India Urban Partnership, and the Resource Efficiency Initiative. So as you can see, there are a lot of these initiatives and projects that have a sustainability or a circular economy angle to it. And most of the activities of the project feed into SDG 6, 7, 9, 11, and 13, and even 17. What we try to do is through the business support project is enable the businesses that are already in India and support them and offer them a green carpet sort of treatment that I would like to call it, in terms of visibility, because we want to be able to name and recognize these companies for working in the sustainability sector. So we launched in 2020 the EU Excellence in India program, which brings together, it's a task force of EU businesses in India that focus on sustainability within their value chains. And these are companies that also focus not only on the value chains, but even their partners, their procurement, all of that all together. So that entire ecosystem, if they focus on sustainability, they are invited to be part of this group. And we have a very good example of Utsav Dikshit from Alpla, who will talk to you about his company. We thought it was important to bring a voice of an EU business that is already in India to share some of their best practices. And that's exactly what we've been doing through these projects between EU and India to talk about and bring about those technologies and best practices so that India can benefit from peer-to-peer understanding, peer-to-peer best practices, and develop its own policies within India through these businesses that we bring to the fore. So with that, I'll stop here and hand it over back to you, Ranjana, and then you might want to call on Utsav Dikshit. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks a lot for sharing with us about EBTC's role and genesis of it and how critical role it has played. I would also like to open up for question and answers to the participants. And before that, as you rightly pointed, maybe we would like to invite Utsav Dikshit, who has joined us today. He's the Senior Manager Sustainability from Alpla. And Utsav, if you can share with us some of the experience that you have in dealing with business and human rights from a private sector perspective. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that warm introduction, Joel, and congratulations to Oxfam. Always very thankful to the EU Excellence in India program for highlighting and nominating businesses for all the work that we do, especially in the private sector, towards reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. What I'd like to do is take the next 5 minutes or so, give you a little bit of context about our company, how we are partnered between EU and India, as well as talk about what we are doing. The focus of my discussion is on achieving sustainable development goals through investment in human capital. So with that, a little bit about Alpla. We are a private company. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, please. Okay, great, thank you. And Alpla stands for Alpine Plastic. We are a plastics manufacturer of bottles and caps. We are a family business founded in 1955 in Austria. Our founders were Alvin and Helmut Lehner. We started in a laundry room and then moved on. We are now the world's largest family-run packaging solutions. We provide bottles, caps, closures, all in plastic. And I know plastic has been one of the focus of the sustainable development goals and sustainability. It's been a hot topic in general. So I wanted to come out and give you an example of a company and what we're doing as a plastics provider to enable sustainability. A little bit about our footprint. We are in 178 production sites, 45 countries. India is one of them where we're partnered as a family business, and north of 21,000 employees. And our markets go all the way from beverages to crop production, beauty care, milk and dairy, food, home care, oil and lubricants, pharma. And we're working with all our customers to enable sustainability in this regard. In India, we have about 2,000 employees, 9 locations, and sustainability has a wide footprint, not only in global, but also in India. As part of sustainability, Alpla signed the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment, which is part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which includes 3 things. One is to eliminate problematic packaging by reducing the weight of plastic packaging. We recognize there's certain applications that you just cannot replace plastic with, but for those we can reduce plastic packaging weight through lightweighting innovation exercises. We also have pledged to produce 100% recyclable plastic packaging by 2025. And for this, we have a Design for Recycling program and related guidelines. And we also pledge to use 25% post-consumer recycled content on average across plastic packaging. And for this, we have a budget of up to 50 million euro a year to enhance recycling capabilities now and in the future. And I'm proud to announce we are recycling north of 150,000 tons of PET plastic bottles, as well as north of 50,000 tons, metric tons of polyolefins and polyethylene rigid plastics as well. So on the sustainability side, our mission and vision is twofold. It is to use human resources as well as natural resources in an efficient and sustainable way, which means not just on raw material and not just on plastics, but also investing in human capital, especially when it comes to issues related to human rights and creating a environment in the workplace that is friendly. So I'd like to take the next few minutes to highlight what we're doing to invest in our human capital with some examples of what we're doing in India. One, we have an Earn While You Learn program, which is an academic adoption program, which we started in one of our plants in Budhi, which is part of our CSR initiatives. Students are given industrial exposure for 5 days a week while they go to college. We also have a dual apprenticeship program, which we started in a mold shop, which is termed as Future Corner. So as part of a 4-year program, 2 years Polytechnic students in Hyderabad, 2 years they're involved in academic curriculum, and then 2 years after that, they're awarded a diploma after going through a 2-year program with us, and then a job offer right after. And they also receive a stipend, and we handpick a set of maybe 10 students who come from underprivileged backgrounds and qualify for such a program. We also have blood donation camps. We've also collaborated with a new startup named Give Red, which has found a technological way to eliminate the gray market in blood donation problem in India through real-time blood donations at the blood banks, as opposed to storage, and giving access to high quality medical care through blood and plasma therapy. We partnered with the midday meal scheme at the Akshay Patra Foundation as well. And I'm pretty proud to announce numerous members of our management teams have donated. Just last week, we initiated the round for 2021 for Akshay Patra. Recently, as part of the gender diversity program, we're a manufacturing company, and so hiring women in the workplace in our manufacturing operations is one of the hardest challenges in the ecosystem in India. And so we have a new plant coming up in August for contract manufacturing, which has 23 women hired in production operations. And here's a list of things we had to do to enable that, which is very unique in manufacturing for hiring females in India. Transportation facilities for safety, doorstep pickup and drop, appointment of female security supervisors in the night shift, a female nurse in the night shift in the manufacturing shop floors, installations of CCTV at the vital locations. Safety in remote manufacturing locations is one that's paramount, and establishing that for gender diversity as one of the harder technical challenges. Besides that, we also take training and development as part of education being a basic human right. We believe education happens in the workplace as well. We have the Gurukul program for technicians on their first year of their technical hiring. And so at the top right of your screen, you'll see a 12-month program on the first day of hire. We have learning and development practices. When we were hit with COVID, we doubled down on the e-Academy platform for employee training, where we do a training needs identification exercise for all our employees at the start of the year, and then produce monthly training dashboards to monitor their progress. Saksham is a program which is implemented to assess the technical skills of our shop floor employees, the technical ones in the production plants, extrusion, blow molding, injection molding, PET, tool room maintenance, and quality departments. And these ones, we develop different levels that they have to reach within a given time frame, and they have scorecards. So it's almost like going through a set of coursework in parallel with your day-to-day in the workforce. When it comes to senior management, we take that seriously as well, and we invest in the Alpine Management Development Program, which is a 14-day program to develop entrepreneurial, personal, and leadership competency. We have the Alpha People Dashboard, which is a training program, again, to assess current status as well as future goals of the employee to plan their career. So when they're hired, they're not just hired into a job, but they're hired into a long-term career where they can see progress over a period of time. And at the top left, you'll see programs around frontline leadership, second-line leadership, as well as executive coaching interventions for senior leaders, where a coach and a mentor is assigned for a period of 6 months to 1 year. And finally, at the bottom right, we have systems and processes, because we believe these are not just one-time activities. These need to be sustainable activities for employees over a period of a sustained window. And so we have processes in place to ensure that not only are these compliant, but that these are all online and measured the right way. And for this, we have two tools known as the Simpliance tool and the LaborWorks tool. So I know I'm over my time of 7 minutes here, but just wanted to highlight a few of the programs we're taking to invest in our human capital, what our sustainability goals looks like. And it's been a great journey with the EBTC and EU Excellence in India program to share these ideas with other businesses as well, to understand the policy items as well. And this has been an eye-opener. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Utsav, and thank you for bringing the perspective from a private sector as well. So I am opening it for our, guests to post their question, and I can already see one of the questions that has been posted by Zain Kirmani, and Joel has already responded to that. But is there anyone who would like to interact with the panelists or have questions or any comments? There, I can see there have been a comment in the comment section as well.
Shall I read out one of the questions?
Sure, Ruth, if you can. Yeah.
So one of the questions is, what's scope for young entrepreneurs through this platform? We want a team that wants to develop import business and across commodities, but the question is how to reach the EU markets, and that's from Zain. So I guess it's a question around opportunities, and is this an opportunity to be connecting EU and India markets?
Yeah, I could take up that question,
sure.
And I already mentioned it in the chat directly to Zen. But Zen, if in case you are interested in, and you are an Indian business and you are interested in establishing yourself within the EU, I suggest that you connect with me post the session. I've already put in my email address. It's fernandes@ebtc.eu, and we would be very happy to support your business in entering the EU. And also make those connections for you virtually. So please do feel free to connect with us. Thank you.
If I could abuse my seat, Ranjana, and ask a question to the panelists, which
Absolutely.
is, do you feel hopeful? So, it's been quite varied listening to the different panelists about the opportunities and the challenges and also the history of where we come from. And I'm not quite sure how I'm feeling about the future at the minute, to be honest. And I just wondered whether the panelists could reflect on, do you think we can achieve the goals by 2030? It's 2021, the clock is ticking. Should we be hopeful?
Ruth, you want to ask a specific panelist or?
Well, I don't mind which of them jumps in. I mean, if they can solve world peace by the end of the call, that'll be great too. I realize it's a big question, but yeah, I'd just love to hear from the perspective of the different panelists, because each of them were talking from a different perspective. So, can we achieve the goals by 2030?
Maybe Rigid. Oh, sorry, Ustav, please. I remember, if I may just interrupt, I remember hearing a lot of positivity out of Rigid. It was actually logical that there is this new enabling environment. Perhaps it's like 6 years late from the start of the 2015 launch, but there's something happening, I think. I'll leave my comments to that and hope that it was Ustav and Rigid will follow up.
Oh, well, I can now only echo what you said, Sean, because you are echoing mine. So, I think, well, personally, I'm an incorrigible optimist, and I think we all should be in this game. Otherwise, it can be extremely disheartening, Ruth. So, I get, we are in a marathon, and if we have to sort of prep ourselves with the stamina, the temperament to run the marathon. We are not in a 100-meter dash. And I think that's exactly what we should sort of tell ourselves every day, that, and the clock will move. The clock is moving. Some of us have been by choice in this area for the last almost 25 years, and the clock has really moved. So yeah, I'm optimist, and I think there is reason for us to be so.
Mark and Joel, it would be good to hear from you as well about your level of optimism.
So I used to, sorry if I can go first. I used to work for the World Economic Forum in Geneva and on an anti-corruption initiative. And well, this is whenever we had any targets to be fulfilled, even if we met halfway or even 3/4, we used to be sort of happy because the clock has to move. And as Sean and Bridget did mention, we do need to see some kind of progress. And I am pretty optimistic that we will reach somewhere. And with all these coalition of the willing that we have created with different subgroups and businesses have also got involved now. So I guess it's also a good sign. And there's also very strong support from the civil society as well. And even the younger generation, the millennials and the younger lot are even interested in such initiatives. So I think that's also very important to get the youth of the world involved. And I guess they are also doing a lot in these initiatives. So I feel very optimistic. Yes, thank you.
I'd say I'm a bit of both. It's hard not to feel optimistic when you look at, as I referred to in my presentation, the huge speeding forward in legislation. And I very much agree with Joel that when you look at younger people, and maybe this is something that happens with every generation, but that there's a lot of hope to be seen there in the attitudes and kind of values that are present at the moment. But at the same time, I think we need to be careful to separate out what we see in terms of what's happening around rights bearers with businesses and politics adopting this and what it actually means on the ground right now for rights holders. So I mentioned this case with Shell at the Supreme Court, which is about pollution in the Niger Delta. So yes, it's wonderful that's going forward, but we're talking about 45,000 people taking this case who still at present have no recompense for the harm they've suffered over decades. So I'd couch it in that sense that yes, it's incredible to see these huge developments on the part of rights bearers, but until that's translated to real change on the ground for rights holders, to use that human rights language, that's when that, I think, hope becomes a reality.
Okay, so any question, is Ishita, in the question box? I see, or the chat.
No further questions here, Angela.
Okay, so I guess it has been a wonderful audience also who have been with us in the webinar for the last 1.5 hours. And as we began that this 1.5 hours, we will be talking about business and human rights, sustainability, sustainable development goals, where lies the opportunities, what could be challenges, and what could be some of the actions, and where we have said that convergence is one of the actions where we are seeing heading towards. Some of the, on the policy front, we have seen that, I mean, starting with Rijit till Sean, we have seen some of the very good policies are upcoming both in India and Europe, and we will be looking forward to see how these are unfolding. But at the same time, I mean, so one of the interesting things that, Sean, I am taking back is the trade action that you spoke about, and which is something to look forward to, which is a very interesting development, and I'm going to closely follow that. Having said that, before I close, thanking all the panelists for making time today and coming and joining us. There are two things from our side, that although we began by saying that this is one of our closure to the global goals to local impact initiative, but for us, it's a beginning of a journey as well. The platforms that we have created for the civil society groups, who we believe would continue to engage with the private sector with the tools and the strategies that we have discussed so far over the last 3 years. So do keep visiting the Responsible Biz website, where we have a plethora of tools and strategic actions, which will keep giving us energy to keep ourselves engaged. We have a lot more other resources from Legal Compendium to podcasts, and also please continue to do that and keep our community of practice, even though it's a virtual platform. And these are the days we have learned how to effectively interact in virtual platform. Keep that platform please alive, and Oxfam will be continuing to have conversation with you on our responsible supply chain work, and as we also initiate our work with the informal sector in India. So that's one. A big thanks to Rijit, Sean, Mark, and Joel, and of course Utsav for making your interventions very important, very powerful. And we will try to have conversations with you on various platforms. Thank you to Ranu and Amitav for joining us. And I must say that they also have remained very strong pillars for us to get global goals to local impact initiatives implemented on behalf of Oxfam India. Thanks a lot to my colleagues, Ruth, Anil, Ishita, for the hard toil of work that you have been doing for the last few days, and Dipakshi. Did I miss anybody? So thank you so much. And I think to all the wonderful participants, whoever have joined us today, thank you so much. And we, as I said, we continue our conversations and keep and of course, how could I forget my wonderful colleague Trinanjan, who made a wonderful presentation, and and added, and a very important note, without him even this learning event wouldn't have been possible, because the last 3 years journey he has been one of the strongest implementer. My apologies, Tri, but yeah. So with that, thank you. And as I said, we continue to have our conversations on the other side. So on behalf of Oxfam India, European Union, and Oxfam GB, thank you so much and look forward to meet you.
Thank you, Ranjana, for moderating. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Ranjana. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ranjana. Thanks, Oxfam.